Hi guys, I'm starting something new here. Every month I'm going to re-release a timeline from the beginning of my career as a YouTuber, alongside making new content. The first one I'm going to do is this one. The Mongols were the greatest conquerors in history. In a matter of a few generations, they were able to conquer an area stretching from Hungary in the west to Korea in the east and from India to Siberia. They brought death and devastation wherever they went. Genghis Khan is tied with Mao Zedong for the greatest mass murderer in history, with 40 million dead caused by his invasions. Europe, with the exception of Russia, was very luckily free from such a horrifying fate. The Mongols did invade Europe and did do very well. They were able to smash the armies of Poland, Hungary, and the Teutonic Knights, and launch horrific raids into the Balkans and Germany. Nothing could stop them. Things were so bad the Pope was preparing to declare a crusade on the Mongols to protect Germany and Europe as a whole from Mongol conquest. However, the unbelievable happened. The leader of the Mongols, Ogadai, died, and so the army left Europe to go back to Mongolia to vote on the next Khan, or emperor. The Mongols never came back to Europe, and so Europe was saved from Mongol conquest. But what if history had been different and the Mongols did conquer Europe? What would culture be like? What would the world be like? That is the question of this alternate history. Ogadai died at the age of 56 of alcoholism, so he definitely could have lived longer if he had a more healthy lifestyle. That is what happens in this timeline, with Ogadai having an intervention to drink less, and so he lives long enough for the conquest of Europe to take place. God, history is strange. A man's alcoholism saved 15 million lives in several different nations. In this timeline, the Mongols press into Germany and the Balkans after Poland. The Mongols were almost never defeated, with the only real example being at Ain-Jalut in Syria, and the Mongols already defeated forces from the German colony state of the Teutonic Knights as well as the Templars, so we can assume they would defeat the German states themselves as well as the various Balkan kingdoms. People like saying Europe's wet and wooded climate would have prevented Mongol conquest, as well as the countless castles. This is wrong. The Mongols conquered southern China, which was much wetter and more humid. Southern China had equally intimidating fortifications, had an equal population, and was united into a single force, unlike Europe's hundreds of little duchies. The Mongols did pretty well against Europe's forces, with their better mobility meaning they were able to ride circles around the pikemen and knights, which made up Europe's armies, firing arrows and wearing them down. After conquering Germany, the Mongols would follow the North European plain west into France, which had just finished the process of unifying all the little duchies. The Mongols would likely conquer this as well. Italy is divided between all sorts of small city-states that have trouble offering up a fight. The Pope would flee to Spain and likely make Santiago de Compostela, the most holy site in that country, the new center of Catholicism. What wouldn't the Mongols conquer in Europe? Firstly, Spain. Spain is simply so far from where the Mongols would start that the Mongols would be insanely overstretched by the time they would reach it. I can imagine some heroic battle in the Pyrenees that would be remembered as one of the decisive battles of history in this timeline. The Spanish were also known for their light, irregular cavalry called jinetes that could play the Mongols at their own game. The second would be England, which, because it was an island and the Mongols don't have such a good record with boats, would be fine. The third would be Scandinavia, which would be in the same category. The fourth would be Constantinople, surprisingly, which would require an insane siege, and being in a faraway corner of Europe would likely be fine, with the Mongols not willing to expend the vast amount of effort needed to seize it without getting any land attached, since what the Mongols wanted the most were pastures and cities were seen as secondary. The Middle East wouldn't be too different. The Mongol Empire was so disparate and regionally organized, with the Ilkhans of the Middle East being organized in a different section from Europe's Golden Horde. The Mamluks would still defeat the Mongols at Ain-Jalut in Syria, stopping the Mongol advance. The Mongols would commit unbelievable atrocities in the conquests of Europe, as they did in everywhere they conquered. Look at Russia, where dozens of cities were massacred, or in northern China, where 30 million people were probably killed, or more than the entire Eastern Front in World War II, or more than twice than everyone the Nazis killed. Expect Antwerp, Rome, Krakow, and Paris to go up in flames. Let's say that the Mongols form a separate Khanate in Europe when central authority falls apart in 1291. Let's call it the Wood Khanate, based off Europe's geography. It would be based out of Hungary, a little piece of the Eurasian grassland stuck in the European forests. The Hungarians were originally a nomadic people, and the Mongols love co-opting native nomad peoples like the Turks and the Tartars into their ruling classes to help rule over the farmers, and so the Hungarians would become the quislings of the Mongol regime. However, Europe would survive as a culture. The Mongols were quite tolerant of native cultures and religions once they became rulers. No one's culture actually changed because of the Mongols. The Mongols would inevitably assimilate into European culture, in the same way they did in every region they conquered. They would convert to Christianity and start to take up the trappings of feudal Europe. The central language of communication across the empire would be Latin, as it was Europe's lingua franca at the time. Most of the bureaucrats who would manage the empire would probably come disproportionately from Germany, with its advanced society's central location and large population. They'd make good managers. The culture of the Mongol court would take on German and Hungarian characteristics. This would result in the unification and blending of European culture to a certain extent, but the regional identities would still survive. The Mongol Empire wouldn't last forever and wouldn't even last that long. Gunpowder made the horse tactics of the Mongols irrelevant, which meant that it was accompanied with the defeat of the Mongol rulers and secondarily the conquest of the nomadic steppe peoples by farming societies. The Mongols also grew decadent. Instead of spending all day in the saddle honing their military strength in the steppe, they languished in good manners eating fine food. We saw this all over the Mongol domains, be they Persia, Russia, or China. This would happen in Europe in the 15th century, with the Mongols being defeated. Ironically, the Mongol conquest would actually spread gunpowder into Europe faster, because Europe would become part of the massive empire that would include China, which invented black powder. Unlike the rest of the Mongol Empire, there would be powerful kingdoms waiting on all sides of the forest Khanate, ready to enter in the power vacuum that would inevitably happen when the empire would fall apart. These would be the Swedes, English, Spanish, and Ottomans. Starting in the west, the English and Spanish would be ready to invade the Mongol Empire. With France far from the central government in Hungary, the English would land in France and the wealthy cities of Flanders, or modern-day Belgium, and conquer the lands west of the Rhine. Remember that the English almost did this in our timeline in the 100 Years' War, against a strong France, let alone a weakened, declining Mongol Empire. The Spanish, meanwhile, would cross into southern France, conquering the Mediterranean coast. They would then invade Italy. The mountains would mean this region is hard to reach from Hungary, so the Spanish would be able to conquer Italy, like they did in our timeline. The Pope would return to Rome, being re-given the Papal States. Remember, also, for all of these, the conquerors would be seen as liberators, taking the regions away from the cruel Mongol yoke. Sweden, meanwhile, being the most powerful Scandinavian nation, would drive into the Baltic and Germany. This is what they did in our time under Gustavus Adolphus and family. The Swedes would conquer Germany and the Baltic shores of Europe, which almost happened in our timeline. The Ottomans, meanwhile, would come out of the southeast, invading the Balkans. Fighting the declining and weak Mongol Empire, the Ottomans would conquer more of Europe, meeting up with the Swedes in Austria and Bavaria. With both sides' supply lines overstretched, central and southern Poland, along with Ruthenia or eastern Ukraine, would be a buffer state between the two nations. Russia, being surrounded on all sides by other nations conquered by the Mongols, would rebel later in this timeline. Instead of 1480, let's say 1560. This would mean that Russia would take longer to develop and advance, with countless side effects I don't know about. This is also complemented by the Swedes likely controlling the Baltic, probably cutting off Russia from the rest of Europe, means that there's a good chance that Russia never would have become a great power in this timeline, simply being a massive hulking force in the east, worrying the same people who are worried that Brazil might become a superpower today. The steppe tribes of Eurasia would still be defeated as a whole. Gunpowder sealed their fate, and even if they conquered all of Europe, the black powder they brought to Europe sealed their doom in the end. Continental Europe as a whole would go in a very different direction. Firstly, it would be much more culturally conservative. All the cultures that were conquered by the Mongols had a cultural conservative backlash when they were able to get independence. Russia was mired in serfdom while the rest of Europe galloped into the Renaissance. China went into the isolationist Ming dynasty, and Persia was taken over by religious fanatics. This was a reaction to being conquered by a violent alien power. This would happen in continental Europe in our timeline. I mean, imagine how the Renaissance would have worked with half the city-states burned down by the Mongols, and then afterwards all the city-states under the Spanish Inquisition's control. Also, the Reformation would never have happened with all the Catholic Europe working together against the Mongols. Europe would remember the Mongol invasions, and the common fear would hold it together long after they left. This would mean that the Renaissance and Enlightenment would mainly be restricted to Britain and Scandinavia, which would suddenly be wealthy from all the gold pouring in from the Empire, but not Spain, which didn't even have it in our timeline because of the intolerant Inquisition. The Renaissance, Enlightenment, etc. would spread outward to parts of Germany and France, but the further east and south you would go in Europe, the more primitive things would get. Continental Europe would also have greater trouble developing property rights and what in our timeline became capitalism. Property rights took hundreds of years to develop in our timeline, and without them, any economy's growth is retarded. If you can't keep what you work for, there's no reason to work. Now imagine the Mongols arbitrarily burning everything and destroying cities. This may seem overblown, but let's take a second look at Russia, the only part of Europe that was conquered by the Mongols for a long period of time. Russia before the Mongols was doing pretty well. It was pretty glued into Europe's trade. The English had a Moscow company that would bring trade in from the Baltic and England and France. Property rights were more advanced in most of Europe at the time, and some Russian states even had parliaments. After the Mongols, Russia became an absolutist state without a real economy, an unquestionable church and rooted in serfdom. Of course, Europe wouldn't be as drastic as Russia, having much better geography and weather, and having civilization be more deeply rooted, but it gives some clue of what the societal effects could be. Also, democracy would be much worse off in this timeline. Compare this map of the Mongol Empire to democracies, and I mean healthy democracies like Japan or Canada, not like Pakistan or Ukraine. Now see it compared to the world, and the Mongol Empire almost seems like a vacuum, sucking out the force that democracies live off. This is probably because democracies tend to correlate with merchant bases, which the Mongols crush, and people are more likely to put their faith in a strongman after having millions of people killed by barbarians. The colonization of the Americas wouldn't be that different from our timeline, the main difference being that France and Holland would not be involved. The long-term differences of this would be that Canada and America would be the same country, because without the French-speaking Quebecois, Canada would be part of the 13 colonies and rebel in the revolution with the other colonies. Indonesia, a Dutch colony, would probably be colonized by the English, who are also a force in the region. This would likely make Indonesia much more powerful. The Dutch tended to just exploit their colonies, not try to develop them. On the other hand, much as Indians don't like to admit it, the British made modern India. They made its legal system, its train system, its military, its sciences, its histories, and its geography. The British created the identity of a unified India, which allowed India to become a regional power. The same treatment likely happened to Indonesia in this timeline, giving them a much better base and a sense of Indonesian identity. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, or support me on Patreon. And as always, thank you for watching, and please stay tuned for future videos.